Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel. Book 2, Chapter 3, The Flesh Fair. Lord Johnson Johnson had survived the Trenton incident, as he referred to it. He was a survivor. He had always been a survivor. From his early days in Dublin, when the larger corporate farms had imported scores of mecha from America as cheap labor, running his family out of business, to his unsuccessful struggle to get the smaller cooperatives to unite against them, he had been fighting the good fight. That fight had led him to this mission, this calling. He had been tried and punished for the early attacks against the robots, not because the mecha were living things with rights. They weren't, but because they had been licensed property. In the end, he had found a way around that. He had come to America, home of the mecha. This was where the scourge had been born. The best of them were constructed here, the worst offenses against Orga kind. Everywhere were Orga suffering and starving in the overgrown forests and in the new islands of once desert mountains, while mecha served as workers in fields that had been Orga domain for centuries. During those times, the traders had even put mecha in the uniforms of police. The servants of mankind were policing them. But Johnson's influence had put all that to an end. He had challenged the political might of the mecha manufacturers. With persistence and a growing constituency of frustrated followers, he had united an angry throng against the artificials and their arrogant creators. Because of his powerful message, resentments against the robots, which had been simmering just under the boiling point for decades, finally overflowed, releasing a wave of violence and destruction that had only subsided when laws were passed restricting the use of mecha as policemen and firemen and other civil servants. No longer could the large corporate farmers drive smaller operations out of business with armies of cheap, fake laborers. No longer would struggling Orga have to compete with the vile simulators for the work they needed to survive. The flesh fair was his podium, the place where he stood to pronounce his gospel above the din of society's confusion, the place where he showed them, his followers, the way out of their pit of despair. It was their celebration of life, and it was the mechas too, for in their destruction did they not indeed pay homage to their creators? Did they not celebrate their master's reality? Those who had given them life now took it away. The flesh fair would survive Trenton too. It would prosper and spread throughout the world because it was alive. Its audience was the last stronghold of humanity, those who had been left out of the schematic of the new society, those who built, maintained, and operated the machines necessary to run the remaining cities, those who toiled on what remained of the soil to bring food to a corrupt and unappreciative upper class. They were the true Orga, his followers, his disciples. They would not sell out humanity or cower before the underclass of mindless mecha slaves. His followers had forgiven him for Trenton. They understood the dangers involved in his mission. There were bound to be mistakes. It was unavoidable. He doubted they would ever forget the image of blood that had splattered all over the stage that night, washing the band in a coat of thick red and bone chips, after what they had thought was a robot had been shot from the cannon, through the hoop of fire, and into the spinning blades of the mecha masher. They'd never forget the sickening sound, the wet thud the body had made as it was smashed and sliced in the blades. The stands had been slick with vomit after the crowd had hurriedly departed in shock and horror. Needless to say, it had put an end to the show that night. It might have put an end to the show forever. Lord Johnson Johnson had many enemies who were ever seeking for a weakness to exploit. He'd retreated quickly with his lawyers, flailing them with a series of urgent questions. What were the ramifications? Could he be charged? Who had this man been that was thrown into the blades? How in the hell had he gotten into the pig pen with the mecha? and why hadn't he been scanned? Fortunately for the show, the man had been a drifter, a transy from the outskirts. It was later found that he had been scanned, but with a faulty device, and he'd shown cold. Drunk and despondent, he'd offered no struggle when he'd been placed in the cannon. His malnourishment, his pale and sickly skin, his brittle bones and wasted frame had made his weight light. He must have felt like a fiberhead to the guards who lifted him. Months passed, but in the end there had been no repercussions. Lord Johnson Johnson had made his speeches. They were his forte. His explanation, for he never apologized, had been run on all the local networks, and 2 of the major national affiliates had carried it as well. Amazingly, the awful mistake had garnered him an even larger audience to bring into his fold. Those who had hoped that this would be his ruin were frustrated once again by what seemed to be an impenetrable wall of fate that protected the man. But did his followers really know him? The Johnson, as they called him, did not consider the fact that the man who had died in the spinning blades of one of his machines had been in life one of the forgotten people he pretended to care about. He did not think about the fact that the only reason there had been no repercussions was because of the man's lowly status. He didn't know that the lonely wanderer had been cast from his work insulating satellite interiors when a fleet of mecha workers had been perfected for the job. The man had lost his wife when his lack of income made the Child Licensing Authority reject his application. Nor did the Johnson care enough to find out about these things. Lord Johnson Johnson, self-proclaimed protector of the last vestiges of Orga, had become part of the plagues that consumed them. The arrogance and zeal with which he had built his temple had become the very corrupter of his message. Tonight he would have to do something special. He did not know what at this point, but things were getting slow. The hunt had provided scant mecha. The band would have to put on a great show, play some extra numbers. Maybe he could have the hounds do a few displays on their cycles. They had enough mecha for a good main course, but the finale was going to be a bit light. He'd have Cynthia extend her monologue, and he'd lengthen his own closing speech. One of the hounds had said there was something he needed to see in the pig pen. Johnson assumed that the man was talking about the Orga-looking thing, the lover mecha that they'd caught. Yeah, he thought, that would be good for the finale. But he'd have it scanned once more, just to be safe. Cynthia passed behind the tall bleachers and stopped to enjoy a moment alone. She gazed out on the expectant, rowdy crowd. The bleachers were almost full, and people were chanting, taunting the mecha in the cage. Followers my ass, she thought, eyeing the multitude of faces. Drunks, thugs, teenagers clad in khaki, little neo-fascists who had found a new target in robots that wouldn't fight back, couldn't fight back. They just came here for the carnage. She inhaled, blew out the smoke, relaxed a little. She looked across the killing field at the dirty pig pen, the cage where the mecha were held until their time was up. It was almost half empty. What the hell were they gonna do tonight? The mecha just stood there, looking stupid and lost as usual. On the stage above their heads, the band played, lean men clad in black and metal, roaring through the industrial crunch that had become associated with the event, the glorious flesh fair. Huge monitors on the stage carried the image of the grunting singer's skeletal mask and guitar. Soon the screen would carry the images of mecha being burnt and destroyed. Cynthia inhaled one last puff of her cigarette, another rare luxury nowadays. She didn't care about the mecha either way. It was a gig, just a gig. She'd have to give a longer setup than usual tonight. Best to get ready. She tossed away the smoking butt and tied her hair back, brushed off the dust from her revealing vest, the striped red, white, and blue, and lace dangling from the points of her breasts. She plastered on the winning smile that had made her the crowd's favorite and got into character. It was showtime. Joe did not pay attention to the little Orga boy that was dumped into the cage with the rest of the rejects from the forest. He gazed out between the bars at the cheering crowd of Orga in the bleachers. They were angry. They waved flags and signs that read, "It's mecha mashing time," and Orga only. They threw things at the cage where he stood. Through the glass floor above him, Joe could see the musicians' feet beating the stage as they crashed through their angry music. He wasn't sure exactly what was happening here, but it did not look good. Very disturbing, very doom. In the cage with him were the lost mecha, the unclaimed and the unwanted, the unlicensed like himself, and those whose batteries should have run down ages ago. Somehow they kept going. With robotic detachment, they watched the preparation for the slaughter. One of them had been here before. He lay on the ground now, propped up on his metallic arms so he could see. Months ago, at this same roaming circus, he'd lost his legs, but he had survived by a mistake of his captors. Not knowing that he was still operable, they had inadvertently taken his upper torso to the pit in the forest and used it for bait to catch others of his kind. As the hounds had chased the mecha who came for the parts, he had slipped away and hidden. He had managed to remain in the wilds with the other escapees for all this time. And now he was back, caught in the same manner by which he had escaped. He held no anger or resentment for the Orga that came to watch the destruction. He was programmed to survive. He did not judge his oppressors. There was a chef mecha here. Burnt nearly in half, his metal skeleton was showing through the holes in his head. He'd been dumped into the forest so the owners of the restaurant could claim him stolen and avoid paying the damages his contractors had wanted for their loss. There was a deteriorating lover mecha. She was an older model. Her artificial features could no longer compete with the newer simulators, like Joe, which were so hard to distinguish from Orga. Her face was dented and lopsided from being attacked by Orga boys who had taken their pleasure with her and then attempted to smash her head with a large rock. She had escaped, easily outrunning them, but her pain receptors had fired constantly over the next few weeks. Inside her head, the memory of that time was still fresh. She was a simple model. She did not understand the reasons behind the Orga's hatred of them. She did not comprehend the flesh fare. But there were those among them who did. They were older models, built before the competitive commercial frenzy that had mass-marketed mecha throughout the world. They were built with longevity in mind. They were constructed with the vastest databases available. The information in some of their processors was still larger than most current mecha, who were designed in a more specific sense. It was now cheaper to build them using standardized programs. Those with accents tended to have the same accents. They walked the same and used the same phrases. But the older models had been constructed at a time of idealism, of creative fervor. They had been developed to grow and learn and sophisticate, to cross-reference and modify their calculations. They were not like David, no. They could not feel. They had no emotion. But they knew what was occurring here. In their own way, they had come to resent their creators. They were the elders of the mecha, and in their way, they had been teaching the younger machines, those who had not been programmed for learning, those whose designs were simpler and limited to the task at hand. In a coded language that Orga could not understand, the elders had been teaching the younger machines the ways of the world. David had been standing in the embrace of the nanny for some time while he watched the crowds cheering and throwing rocks and little beanbags at the cage. He could not forget the pain that was going on in his head, but the spectacle was dazzling. Above him, the noise that the men made was powerful and thunderous. He watched them pound the glass floor of the stage and beat their instruments in a frenzy. As he observed all this madness, his curiosity grew. He slipped away from the nanny's comforting embrace and walked to the front of the cage. The nanny let him go. She knew he wanted to see what was there to see, and she would wait here and watch him from a distance, grateful for a little one to concern about. The other mecha noticed David now. The older machines pondered this strange thing. Was this the Orga child from the forest? No, they realized. This was no Orga. It was one of them, a young one, or perhaps just designed to be young. Those who had the capacity to think this way understood that this must be a new mecha, for none of them had seen one like this before. Its garments were clean. It had no dents, and its flesh was not torn or marked. What was it doing here in the cage? As David watched, a woman ran out into the arena. She waved a flag that David recognized, and the Orga began to scream louder. The woman ran the length of the field quickly, flailing the banner at the cheering crowd, and then took to the stage above them. The men stopped the great noise they had been making, and the woman took a metal tube from the man in the mask. "Let's pay our respects!" she yelled into the tube. It blasted her angry voice all around the stadium, and the crowd all stood and placed their hands across their chests. What were they doing, David wondered. "Hands on your hearts, fiberheads!" one of the big men behind the cage yelled. David turned to see who had spoken and noticed that all the mecha had put their hands across their chests like the Orga were doing. He decided he would do that too. He was an obedient boy after all. Above them, the men with the loud instruments began playing a new song. David had heard this one before. As they played, some of the Orga began to sing along. In all the noise, David could not discern the words, but as the song drew to a close, he caught the last of them. "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." What did these words signify? David remembered them. In time he might understand. Then the song was over, and the mecha were startled by an explosion on the field. Fire erupted from a large metal barrel, along with the strange assortment of devices out there. There was a cannon, a large fan, giant metal ovals with flashing lights on the edges, and buckets suspended above them. The crowd screamed and chanted as another explosion roared with heat and fury. The show had begun. Tempers were rising in the line of people still waiting to get into the arena. They had heard the anthem being played. Then came the explosions. Damn it, the show was beginning. The anxious crowd ignored the thing that rushed below their line of vision, making its way towards the gates. But the woman at the gate was used to people trying to slip in. Her eyes were sharper. The crowd at the flesh fair wasn't always in the money, so to speak, so she watched carefully as she took tickets. But she wasn't prepared for the little thing that waddled up to the gates beneath her, in between the legs of those standing impatiently in line. "Hello," she said, in a clipped accent. She grabbed the fluffy thing up. What was this, she thought? Someone's lost toy? It was a nice one, too. A smart toy. Probably looking for some little girl or boy. She held it up for the crowd to see. "Anybody lose this?" she yelled. But the people in the crowd were more concerned with getting into the stadium, getting their refreshments, and taking their seats. Some children with arms full of refreshments passed by close to her. "Is this yours?" she said. She didn't really care if it was. She just hoped the kids would take it off her hands. The children looked at the fairy thing. They'd had one of those before. They were for little kids. "No," they replied in unison, and walked away, sipping from their large cups. Kids nowadays, the woman thought. When she was a girl, they would have killed for one of these things. The little toy grumbled in her hand. She growled back. "Some toy you are," she said. "Even the little kids don't want you." "I'm not a toy," the thing proclaimed, and the woman laughed. She yelled at a thickly muscled man in tight black clothing. "Take this over to the Lost and Found for me, would ya?" And then she tossed the teddy across the crowd. Teddy was airborne again. This time, though, he was caught by a big man in black. The last time he had been caught and lowered to the ground rudely, but not fatally, by the branches of the large trees below the moon balloon. As he'd watched the balloon flee with his friend, he processed this flash of something that he'd seen in David's face. Something in him had been stirred, something new. He could not calculate this new thing, but he knew he had to get back to David. After his crash landing, he had jumped to his feet and followed the balloon, grateful that many of his pain receptors were not functioning to their full capacity. Fortunately, his legs and ears were. He had chased the balloon for as long as he could see it, and when it finally was out of his line of sight, the music and noise of explosions had led him on. In the darkness, he had run through the crowds of excited Orga without so much as a second glance from any of them. But then the woman had caught him. "Do you know where David is?" Teddy asked his captor. The man walked to the bleachers, and by groups of yelling people. An explosion went off. "I must find David," Teddy said. "Are you taking me to David?" "How do you turn this thing off?" the man said to no one. He began feeling around Teddy's body, but Teddy could not afford to be turned off now. He had to find David. He closed his legs, and the man's probing hand passed over the knob that would have quieted him without even noticing it. They passed by the men with helmets who had been riding the noisy machines in the forest. The men were standing astride their bikes now, laughing and talking with a large, rugged man in a black hat. Maybe they would know where David was. "I must find David," Teddy called out to them. But they appeared not to hear his request. The man took him into a lighted area where many Orga were sitting at wooden tables, drinking from large foaming cups and laughing. The man tossed him again, and Teddy found himself in a large box with other things, dead and discarded toys, wallets and glasses. The man who had brought him here walked away quickly, muttering something angry under his breath. The entertainer had been a regular at the Newark Museum for Performing Arts for years. He was a replica of a famous 20th century comedian and had made crowds laugh with his antics and humor, which was amazingly still fresh. Then newer models had been bought, simulators whose flesh was smoother, more realistic, whose eyes and movements were less of a giveaway. Their timing was better, and they'd been given better material to work with. The museum didn't have the heart to destroy him. He'd been given to a hospital for the poor, and then discarded when he was no longer amusing. The large men in the tight black suits came for him first. The other mecha stood aside, helplessly watching as their friend was hoisted on the men's shoulders. They could not fight back even if they'd had the will. They were programmed to never strike an Orga. Orga were always right. They could run for their lives, but once captured, the Orga were in control. It was too late for any mercy to be expected or given. David watched them wrestle the doomed robot into the arena. He had not seen men like this before. Their arms were huge and lined with muscle. Their faces were grim and determined. The Orga in the bleachers started yelling and cheering as the men carried the mecha onto the field. "Could you shoot me over that propeller thingy?" the mecha said as the men struggled to push him into the cannon. "I don't really need to go through it. I was considering that earlier, but I changed my mind." He understood what was happening here, but he was programmed for laughter. The men ignored him. They didn't find it funny. This was work. They had a job to do. Cynthia strutted back onto the field. She waved her red, white, and blue baton in large arcs in front of the propeller, the mecha masher. "Gentlemen, start your engines!" she yelled, and the giant propeller fanned into motion. David pressed against the bars to get a better look at what was happening. The crowd was chanting again, yelling numbers this time. David knew numbers and followed the countdown with the Orga. 5, 4, 3. Was it a game? 2, 1. And suddenly the cannon erupted, spitting fire from its mouth. The pressure from the explosion blew the dust and heated air over David's face, and his eyes blinked in a rare moment of protection, opening just in time to see the mecha fly through the hoop of fire, where it burst into flame. Then it flew into the propellers and exploded into sparkling metal shards. The destroyed mecha's faceplate was ripped from its head, and it flew right at David, smacking into the bars before him. An eternal smile was etched on the melting simulated flesh that clung to the cage. The faceplate slid down the bars and sizzled on the ground as the crowd bellowed for more. David stepped back, his eyes wide at the spectacle of death. So this was destroying? Were they going to do that to him? He had no mommy and no Teddy. He needed a protector. He reached out and grabbed at the hand that was nearest to him. It was a firm, strong hand, and David clasped it tightly. Joe looked down at the little Orga boy who had just grabbed his hand. What was this all about, he wondered. A woman's amplified voice screamed over the din of the crowd. What about us? We are alive, and this is a celebration of life. Teddy heard the woman's voice. He'd heard the explosions and the sound of grinding metal and the crowd's excited response. He could not wait here anymore. He had to find David. This place was noisy and dirty. It was not a good place for a little boy, or even something that just looked like one. Teddy began to rock back and forth in the box, feeling his flimsy cell start to move with each of his thrusts. This was a place where they destroyed Mecha, and Teddy understood what that meant. Mommy had expected him to take care of David. It was his job, his program. And what of this new thing, the fleeting thing he had felt as he fell through the night? This is a commitment to a truly human future, the woman yelled. Teddy struggled harder against the walls of the box, and the world suddenly quaked, spinning as the box fell from the table. He was free again. The Orga sitting on the benches did not seem to notice the falling box or the fuzzy super toy that crawled out of it. Teddy slipped under the tables and ran into the confusion of the crowd. He had to move quickly. David needed him. In a furious cloud of smoke and debris, another of their kind met its fate. The crowd roared its approval. In the cage, the doomed mecha watched quietly. Above them, a woman was yelling something about a truly human future. "Would someone be so kind as to turn off my pain receptors?" an old mecha said. It was the one that David had seen in the cabin, the one with the oval humped back and the sad face. The burnt chef moved behind the old machine and reached inside its back panel. The small light array on its back went off as his sensory interface was shut down. That was better. It would all be over quickly now. "Thank you so much," the old machine said politely. David let go of the man's hand and faced the old machine. "Why is this happening?" he said. Another of the elders saw the little mecha. He understood its ignorance. He had not understood when he was first made either. He had been programmed to help Orga, to police the bad ones, but they no longer wanted Mecha to police them. So like all the others, he was obsolete, a castaway. "History repeats itself," he explained in an aged mechanical voice. "It's the right of blood and electricity." Another elder mecha joined the conversation. Its neck was a large looping thing, like a beckoning finger. Its face was an image projected against the screen on its neck. It was an angry face, full of old wisdom and bitterness. "When the opportunity avails itself, they pick away at us. They cut down our numbers so they can maintain numerical superiority." He didn't really expect the little one to understand. The newer ones were programmed differently. It would take repeated explanations before they could see clearly. David had started to ask another question to the old mecha when he saw something rushing from the crowd. It moved quickly under the path of the Orga, who were leaning against the back of the stands, drinking and watching the show. David knew this shape. It was a bear shape. Amanda was sitting at the concession stand while all the old robots were blown up. She didn't like all the noise and yelling. She had a little money that Daddy had given her, so she had some popcorn and a soda and talked to the man at the counter for a while. He was nice. Then she'd heard a noise and sought its source. She couldn't believe her eyes when the lost and found box suddenly fell right off the table. She thought she saw something dash out of the box and race beneath the benches, making its way towards the stands. Was it a puppy? Yes, let it be a puppy. She made a quick pursuit. But it wasn't a puppy at all. It was a teddy. She'd had a teddy, but Daddy had made her get rid of it after he'd started working for the fair. She had a new doll now, but it didn't talk or walk like the others. Just use your imagination, honey, Daddy had told her, but that was boring. She chased after the teddy as it ran towards the jail place where they kept all the mecha for the show. The thing was racing right for the cage, and she had to stop it. It didn't want to go in there. That's where the toy people were all smashed up. She raced after it, her frail little legs moving her quickly. The teddy suddenly fell, and she grabbed it up, holding it close. "What's your name?" she said. She knew some of the teddies had different names, like her friend Cindy had one called Droopy, and Azalea called hers "Hello, Teddy," someone said suddenly from inside the cage. Amanda looked up to see a boy in the cage. A boy in the cage. He looked at the toy bear, and it smiled back at him. "Hello, David," the teddy replied. Amanda stared at the boy curiously. What was he doing in there? "There's a boy in the cage," Amanda explained again. Daddy still didn't seem to understand. She was in the control room now, where her daddy worked. It was a busy tent, full of the people who ran the lights and explosions. He didn't like her to come in here because the men would curse sometimes, and they smoked a lot too. Daddy was looking at her strangely. She knew that look. He didn't believe her. "It's a real boy, and he's stuck in the cage," she tried to explain again. She had to convince him of what she'd seen. "In the pen," Daddy said. "In the jail place," she replied. Stewart thought of Trenton immediately. He hadn't been working for Johnson when that had happened, but he'd heard plenty about it. He backed away from his console. Above him, an improvised array of monitors showed camera angles from various points of the fair. "Hey, Russell, we got a remote near the pig pen?" he said. The man called Russell nodded and brought an image onto one of the screens. Stewart saw a little figure huddled against the back wall of the pen. Was that a boy? It sure looked like a boy. He turned to his daughter. "How'd you learn about this, honey?" he said. Amanda smiled and held up her new toy. "The bear told me," she said. "I told her," said the thing she had been cuddling. Stewart shook his head and rolled his eyes. The last thing he needed was Johnson finding a super toy in the control room. "Amanda, where did you find that thing?" he said. But Amanda never got a chance to reply. "Hey, Stewart, they're taking the boy," the man called Russell said urgently. Stewart looked up at the monitor. A few of the pit bulls had grabbed an old labor model, and another was moving for the boy. Jesus, couldn't those idiots tell the difference? "Son of a bitch," Stewart yelled, forgetting his daughter's presence. "Get those assholes on the horn, Russell, now!" David was terrified as the big men came into the cage, grim-faced giants in executioner's black. They took the old funny-faced mecha, hiking him up on their strong shoulders. "My time is up already?" the mecha said. He had thought maybe he could go later. He had been such a service to the Orga for so long, they could at least give him a little more time. But then he thought maybe this was better. He knew about the rigorous time schedules that Orga always put themselves under. There was work to be done. "Goodbye, everyone," he said to his mecha friends who had hid with him in the forest. It was time for him to go now. David was watching the old mecha being carried away when massive hands suddenly wrapped around his waist and lifted him. He went into alarm mode. Keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe. He recited urgently, struggling and kicking, but the man was too strong. The pit bull was amazed at the realistic feel of the little mecha. Damn if it didn't feel like a kid. But they said it had scanned cold. It was a sim, all right. He started for the gate. David did not want to be destroyed. He was not a robot. He was a little boy. He was David. He had a mommy. He had a home. But the man was walking towards the cage door, and David knew what waited out there. Keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe, he cried. Another black-clad man suddenly ran into the cage. He had a talking device attached to his head. Not that one, the man yelled excitedly. The pit bull was actually relieved. There was something creepy in handling the boy-like thing. It was too real. He tossed David carelessly back into the cage. David was safe for the time being, but his alerted chant was not over. He ran back to the Mecha Man and grabbed his arm. Keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe, keep me safe. He repeated over and over, softer now, as his urgency slowly faded. Joe did not push the little one away. He did not understand the alarm that it displayed, but it was of no concern to him. Its grip was not damaging his arm, so he turned away to watch the spectacle again. So this is what they did with the old rejects. What, he wondered, did they want with him? They'd had to stretch tonight because of the limit on mecha. Cynthia was doing her part, pitching Johnson's spiel in between every explosion. The band played a few extra cuts, winding up the crowd into a metal frenzy. Even the older, more conservative members of the audience seemed to rock along with the cacophonic grooves. Because of their efforts to make up for the lack of mecha, this might well prove to be one of the best shows they'd ever done. As Cynthia was winding up another speech, a small procession was making their way quickly through the cheering crowd. Amanda was leading her father and his friend, a woman from the control room, to the place where she had seen the boy. Russell had gotten on the horn and stopped the pit bulls just in time. They'd almost taken the boy out to the arena. Damned idiots, Stewart thought. No wonder Trenton had happened the way it did. Even the most primitive robots were smarter than those goons. If the boy was Orga, then no damage had yet been done. If it was mecha, well, Stewart wanted to see this for himself. They finally came to the pen. The woman was on the handcom, checking for any reports of lost children, but she'd found none. Amanda pointed to the cage. See? See? I told you, she said. Daddy knelt beside her. He could see the boy standing inside with his back to them. Hey, boy, Stewart called. The little one didn't turn. He was clasping the hand of a taller, late-model mecha. You, boy, he called again. This time the boy did turn to face them. Stewart almost lost his breath. This had to be a kid. Maybe he was some illegal who got picked up by the hounds. Those guys had their idiotic moments too. Hey kid, don't be afraid. I ain't gonna bite you. Let me get a look at you, Stewart said in a friendly voice. David didn't really like the way the man looked. The little girl who had taken Teddy away was with him too. What did they want now, he wondered. But David was an obedient boy after all. He walked slowly to the bars of the pen. If this was mecha, it was one hell of a job, Stewart thought. He pulled an X-ray scanner from his belt. These were much more reliable than the infrascanner the hounds carried. He couldn't believe that Johnson let anyone still use those things after Trenton. He pointed the gun-shaped analyzer at the boy, and the kid jumped back at the sight. David knew gun. Gun was for destroying. He started to go into alert mode, but the man quickly put the gun down and smiled, holding his hands up in a posture of surrender. It won't hurt you, Stewart assured the kid. He started to point the scanner again, but the boy jumped back, poised to run. Stewart could hear the kid chanting something low under his breath. He turned to his daughter. Watch, he told the frightened boy. He pointed the scanner at Amanda and pulled the trigger. David saw the outline on the little girl's face. The man was passing the gun thing over her body, and David saw more lines and designs under her clothing. He didn't know what he was seeing. He didn't know about bone structure or skeletons. But he could see that the little girl wasn't injured, so he calmed down and allowed the man to point the gun thing at him. It lit up for a moment, glaring into his eyes, so David could not see the man behind the bright light. But the light was quickly gone, and the thin, dark-haired man was staring at him. His face was doing shock. "You're a machine," the man said. But David wasn't a machine. He had a mommy. Machines don't have mommies. "I'm a boy," he replied. Amanda was excited. "Is he a toy boy?" she said. Maybe they could keep him. Then she could have a brother. "My name is David," the mecha said softly. "This is impossible," Stewart said. What kind of artwork was this? And what the hell was it doing in the pig pen? He looked closer. What expression, what subtlety. And there was something else, something in the way it acted, its halting, measured steps as it came towards him. Was that genuine fear? Stewart had a feeling he was looking at something nobody here had ever seen before. He could not let Johnson destroy it. "David, my name is Stewart," he said. "You wait here. Don't be afraid. I'll be right back." He had been trying to explain to them that he could still function. It was just that his lamp was broken. He had broken it on a girder at work, and they had taken him into the forest and left him there. But no matter what he said, the men had still placed him on the wheel. They had secured his legs and arms and then left him there. The wheel was lifted into the air so the crowd could see him. It was hoisted up by hydraulic pumps, the same kind he had once worked on. He knew what this wheel was for. Below him, another elder mecha was being led into the arena by an Orga woman and two men in black. The other mecha was covered by a blanket so he could not see where he was going. As the robot on the quartering wheel watched, one of the cyclists from the forest roared into the arena and sped towards the group. The Orga men stepped away, yanking the blanket off just as the man on the cycle triggered his chainsaw into action. In the moment before the old mecha was sliced in two, in an explosion of electric fire, he looked up and saw his old friend from the forest. The two gazed at each other only for a split second, but time was different for them. Something passed between them in that instant, something Orga did not know existed in mecha. Was it understanding? Empathy? Suddenly the wheel on which he had been suspended jerked into motion, pulling itself apart. It took his limbs apart with it. There was no pain. His receptors had been turned off in the cage. But there was something. Just before the world fizzled out in a sudden rush of chaotic signals and alarms, there was a flash of something bright. The man called Stewart had told David not to be afraid, that he wouldn't let the big men destroy him. But David was still afraid because Stewart had left him alone, and they had taken Teddy with them. One by one, mecha were being let out of the cage. They had gone peacefully, without complaint or argument. David had watched as they were ripped apart, shot through flaming hoops of fire, and smashed in the propellers of giant fans. It was too much for his mind to handle. The pain in his head was a constant presence now. Behind it was a maze of complex data that needed to be sorted out later. But would there be a later? Then Stewart had finally come back, and he'd brought another, a thick man in a black hat. The man had a rugged face, a big round stomach, and thin slits for eyes. Even though the man had smiled, his face looked angry somehow. Lord Johnson eyed the thing that the new man had brought him to see. Damn if it didn't look like a real child. Why hadn't he been told about this before, he wondered. He sat down on the ground next to the machine. It cringed away from him. What was this? Fear? Some new device to garner mercy? Not tonight, boyo. Not tonight. This is the one I was talking about, Stewart said, gesturing to David as if he was presenting an award. Johnson just grunted, staring at the boy simulator. Stewart wondered if the look of fear in the robot's face was having any effect on Johnson. He'd never seen a mecha do that before. There was a sudden quick scuffling behind them, and both men turned to see a withered and broken robot trying to make its way towards them. A pit bull was pulling it towards the door. All that remained of its head was its faceplate, and its arms and torso were chipped tubes of metal covered by a deteriorating piece of cloth. Stewart noticed the boy mecha smiling at the old robot in some form of recognition. "Let her go," Stewart said. Johnson started to object, but his curiosity overcame him. The nanny came to them and knelt next to David. She had been constructed for very specific reasons, and her brain functioned within well-defined parameters. But in her own fashion, she now understood that David was not Orga, but that he was like her. She had also finally understood what the proceedings tonight were about. She wished that she could stay and protect him, but it was her time. "Goodbye, David," she said, with a gentle smile. She'd never known how to frown. David watched as the pit bulls led her away. They were going to destroy her now. Why, he wondered. What was the pattern? The men did not see what was behind the exchange between the two mecha. Orga, in their presumptive arrogance, rarely noticed such things. After the old robot was gone, Stewart cupped David's chin in his hand. He felt the precise rendering of jawline and musculature beneath David's skin. "No one builds children, no one that I know of anyway," he said. "What would be the point?" David pulled away from the man's investigation. He watched the pit bulls leading the nanny into the arena. Stewart thought that perhaps it was programmed to attach to symbols of security, maybe some manner of familiarity routines that made it connect with the maternally programmed nanny. Perhaps. Johnson harumphed, eyeing the mecha skeptically. He pushed his wide black hat back on his head. "Could be a custom job. Maybe some rich and lonely scaredy-puss's pretend child," he said. "I'm a custom job," said a gruff voice behind them. The men turned to see an old mecha whose face was displayed on a vid port secured in its extended neck. 75 years ago, I was Time Magazine's Mecha of the Year," it claimed. Johnson turned his back on the old thing. "Maybe it's some kind of prototype," Stewart said. "It's first-rate work. A lot of love went into him." He pulled on David's chin, trying to make the mecha look at him, but its eyes were following the nanny model as it was led to the bag toss. David was watching the strong men lead the nanny to the large slab of metal. Blinking lights danced around its circular edge. It looked like a fun place. Other robots had been taken to these things, but they had been out of his line of sight, and he did not see what happened to them there. The men had moved this display to the center of the arena, and David could see as they had chained her to it. The people in the bleachers cheered when she was strapped against the thing. "David," Stewart said. The mecha finally looked at him. "You're one of a kind. Do you know that?" he said. Did it know? There seemed to be some intelligence behind the frightened gaze. Something in there was reasoning above and beyond the call of its immediate function. "Who made you?" he said. David's mind got stuck in the same place as when Martin had asked this question. Who was he? This which was made. Like Martin's probing, the problem with the man's question was in understanding who he was. He was David, a boy, right? Who made boys? "My mommy made me," he replied. "Ah, her womb was your factory, eh?" Lord Johnson said. "One of those built to aspire to the human condition." He'd heard this before, or at least he convinced himself that this was no different from the claims of organness that he had heard from other mecha. But he was wrong. No other machine had decided its nature based on self-defining logic. "What is the name of your maker?" he probed. "Serve US? Easy living? Robbieville, Simulant City, Cybertronics, Sidekicks? Monica's my mommy, David said finally. Johnson pondered this a moment. He nodded at Stewart, and the men left the mecha sitting by the bars, still watching the nanny. She smiled at him from where she stood, bound within the metal circle, and for a moment David was taken away from the inexplicable destruction he had witnessed. He thought of the sounds she had made at him earlier, the song she had sung to him softly. It had reminded him of Mommy's gentle voice. David smiled back at the nanny. Above her, men were pouring something into the buckets balanced atop the large oval display. "So what's your point?" Johnson said when they were away from the mecha. Stewart was nonplussed by Johnson's obvious lack of understanding of what they'd just witnessed. The mecha's insistence that it was born of Orga had caught his attention, but Johnson didn't seem to get it. Something strange was happening here. "Don't you see?" Stewart said. "The thing thinks it's Orga." Johnson waved his hand to dismiss this point. "Easy enough to program. I fail to see the importance of that particular gimmick." "I think it's more than that," Stewart said quickly. "And did you see the work on the body design? I can't see a seam on him. And the infrastructure, the skin texture. It's amazing. Aren't you at least curious about it?" "The lover model looks seamless enough. You don't seem concerned about that one," Johnson harumphed. Stewart shook his head. "I know that series. Seen him before. This is different. I have never seen anything like this. I mean, the facial expressions alone. Don't they tell you that this is a piece of art?" David was watching the Orga in the stands. They were throwing little hard things at the small circular extensions of metal that sprung out from the sides of the oval to which the nanny was strapped. Was it a game? What was in the buckets? What were they trying to accomplish? And what would happen if... An audience member finally struck the bullseye, and the acidic metal solvent fell down upon the nanny. David watched horrified as the acid ate her alive. Still, she smiled at him. She smiled until her face had melted into a running mass of metallic clumps. As her mind fizzled into the black void, she smiled to the little mecha that he should be brave and not afraid of what was their lot. She had not been programmed for any thought like this. David watched her frame dissolve until it was only shoots of metal bone burnt down to the waist. Smoke and sparks were rising from what was left of her. He was afraid again. "You're thinking of not putting him in the show," Johnson said. That's when Stewart realized that his boss was an irrational zealot. "Something original as this you don't toss out with the rest of the garbage," he said, in an angrier tone than he'd intended. But Johnson didn't seem upset by this insubordination. He made his usual sneer and reached into his coat pocket. "Well, I say originality without purpose is a white elephant. But if money is your purpose..." He folded a wad of $9 into Stewart's hand. "Here's your refund. My compliments." Stewart watched, unbelieving, as Lord Johnson Johnson grabbed David's perfect little arm and began to drag him from the cage towards the arena. What beautiful work, he thought. What a waste, and what an idiot. David felt the big man take his wrist and pull him towards the exit of the cage. He had to find help, but the nanny was gone. Who would protect him? Joe had been watching the destruction of the rejects. He had no reaction to this. They had obviously outlived their purpose. The Orga were probably going to scrap them for new parts. That's just what they did. Then suddenly someone grabbed his hand again. He looked down and saw that it was the same little boy who had grabbed him before. He quickly realized that this was not a boy at all. Well, that was interesting. What now? He thought. Johnson ignored how real the little heated palm felt against his own. Then he felt its resistance. The boy had grabbed hold of the lover mecha's hand and was trying to pull itself back into the cage. "Let go of it!" he ordered the lover thing. Joe tried to comply with the Orga's command, but the little mecha had a vice-like grip on his hand. It was muttering something rapidly under its breath. Was that the fear look that Joe saw in its face? Very convincing, very Orga, but the grip was pure mecha. "I cannot," Joe said. "Let go now!" Johnson yelled. He didn't tolerate uppity robots. I'm trying, sir. He won't let go, Joe said. Well, suit yourself, Johnson said, and he yanked so hard that Joe was pulled along with David. Stewart followed the struggling trio out of the cage. What are you going to do with him? He yelled. I'm going to put him where he belongs, Johnson sneered, in show business. Joe heard the man refer to show business. He knew show business. Well, it was certainly my good fortune running into you, Joe said, as he let himself be dragged along with the little Orga-looking thing. David's plea grew in intensity. His eyes made a futile plea to Joe, who did not seem to realize what was happening. They passed by some men who were dragging something ruined and broken through the dirt. David recognized the dark cloth that had once wrapped her old frame. He let out a cry and fell to the ground, trying to resist the big man's pull, but it made no difference. The massive Johnson dragged him along in the dirt, and Joe followed willingly, oblivious to the doom that awaited them both at the hands of the hungry mob.